As you can tell, we're pretty informal up here, so thank you, President, for your nice introduction, and thank you all for taking the time off your busy day to come and spend a little time with us. For you that don't know, and you may have seen that our traditional names, I'm Chexanexwh, that's my traditional name, and Tah Mahs is Ellie's traditional name. We were visiting with the folks here a few minutes ago, and we thought maybe we'd start by talking a little about where we're from, for you folks that don't really know us, even though we're just across the bay from you. There's about 5,000 of us, Lummis, and we've got about 12,600 upland acres, and we have 5,000 acres of tidelands. Our culture and our tradition is, as if you've heard folks talk about, is around the salmon. We're the Black Tah Mahs people, we're the people of the sea, Sxwo'le, and that's our way of life, and it's all tied to the sea. We see lots of the salmon is around a phrase that we've coined recently if folks have probably heard about the miner's canary. We see the salmon as the miner's canary because it's connected to everything, and especially folks that are dealing with marine science and with the ecology, we know everything's tied together and it's connected, and so we see that the healthiness of the salmon is tied to the healthiness of our ecosystem. And so that's kind of how we're going to talk about a little bit today in terms of how our history is tied to that. I've had the opportunity over the years to spend time with a lot of our elders and serve on our tribal council for a number of years, and one of our senior councilmen way back in the 70s talked about that we had some very, very smart people. We were very fortunate coming from this area here, and they figured some things out. But he simplified it in the context of it's really common sense. And it's really a lot of competing interests. And over time, that we try to think we can control it from the standpoint of being human beings. We're coming to find out that we believe that we can't. And so a lot of our challenges, I think, are around that we think we can mitigate and we can control everything. And as we talk through this today, you'll kind of see how our viewpoint is coming from there. Both Ellie and I see this as a result of both of our life's journeys. Ellie's very much involvement with you guys may have heard about the LGBT and the Wachia trying to protect Cherry Point for us, and Ellie was very involved into that. And more recent, we got a little bit involved in the Atlantic Salmon issue, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But we also wanted to talk a little bit about what our life was like when we were growing up. I'm a little bit older, and when I grew up, we grew up on the river. For folks that don't know us, Marietta was a small little community on the river right near our reservation. It's where I grew up, and one side of the road was on our reservation, one side was off. It so happened my family was off the reservation, but if I walked across the road, I was on the reservation. We also had fishing villages where, as young kids, we grew up on our river, both from the standpoint of fishing in skiffs. Our parents fished in the river. They also had a number of large gill netters and a number of large seiners. So my father was the first seiner, so he fished a lot, both in terms of in the Salish Sea and also on the ocean, as well as I spent a lot of time up in Alaska growing up every summer, going up because that's where we went fishing for salmon in the summertime. My mother, though, she fished. So even though I come from a large family, the ladies in the summertime actually stayed home and fished in the river. So we grew up on the river fishing, and as young kids we got the benefit of spending and learning the river and growing up on that side. As time went on, though, as we got older, we actually started going with my dad and fishing up in Alaska a lot more. And then as a result of that, we fished the whole West Coast. I've had the benefit of being able to fish from Togiak clear to Costa Rica, so I got the benefit of seeing them. And then looking then through time, just like you younger folks will see, is is as we're younger, we have a certain perspective based on our level of knowledge, and as we get more knowledge, our perspective changes and we add to it. And that's kind of really where we've come to reflect on what's really important with us, clear up to the standpoint of understanding our culture even more and understanding the thinking of our people and how the language is so important and critical to us and tied to our values and our beliefs as Lummi. So with that, I was going to go ahead and pass it over on to Ellie and let her talk a little bit maybe about Wachiyukan, and then if you want to talk a little about the Atlantic Salmon.
Sure. You guys were all aware of Wachiyukan, our village site at Cherry Point. Are you guys aware of the coal terminal that they tried to put in there? There you go. Good. The best way to fight the coal terminal was to let people know that it was a major village site. Because that part wasn't out there, that part wasn't in the news. And we didn't have big budgets to be able to put commercials out there to let people know that. And I found the best way to do that was talking one-on-one to people. And just to let them know that you don't understand that this is a village site. And I mean, their idea of protecting our village site, they said, well, they weren't actually going to disturb it. They were going to put 70 acres of coal on top of it. So it would be okay, it would be protected. And it wasn't so much, well, it was, what they were doing to the village site. It was also the fact that they were putting, and I can't even remember what the figures were now, I think it was 4,000 feet of dock in Cherry Point over eelgrass beds. And just the tankers that were going to come in, the coal dust that would hit the water, even though it was going to be state-of-the-art and we weren't going to see the coal dust. Every one of those has an impact on our fishing, on our being allowed to be out in our water, in our UNA. So there wasn't a single part. And then we raised fishers. We have two sons. And if I put my hat on and I was a mother, I didn't want my children out fighting those tankers. You know, and every one of those tankers, even when they were anchored, given their length, and then given the circle they would spin on anchor, we would lose these 4-mile areas, and you have to stay 1,200 feet away from them, that we wouldn't be allowed to fish or crab. It would just seem pretty devastating that it was even something that was being considered for the Pacific Northwest. So luckily, it was a 5-year fight, and we've been able to stop it for now. But the fight is never truly done until we actually own that land again, and then we can forever protect that, the village site. So that's what I spent the last 5 years doing, was fighting it.
So then that tied into the Sxwo'le, which is the reef-net. And some of you folks may not know what that is, but it's a place-based fishery that we were fortunate enough that our tribe was the one that created that type of fishing, and it's a process that's where the actual fishing boats are anchored, and they actually create an artificial reef where the salmon come into, and then they've used technology to actually refine it now. But we got into it from the standpoint of we see they're working with some other tribal members that were actually trying to resurrect the reef-net fishery because it was one of our traditional ways, and we see there's an opportunity to create wellness through it. And so we got involved in it there. But the other thing that it was since it was actually the origin of the way we fished at Lummi, that it would also be a place-based fishery right outside of Wachiyukan. And so we decided that we would get involved in it, both from the standpoint of wellness to help our people, but also from the standpoint of making a statement that we're going to go ahead and put our reef net here right where the stock's going to go in. So some folks kind of seen that as radical environmentalism. We didn't. We just seen it as a very practical thing to do in terms of trying to resurrect our fishery here, and especially since it was our traditional fishery. Then in more recent times, we got involved with the Atlantic salmon. And maybe you want to go ahead and talk about how that happened?
You guys all heard about the Atlantic spill, right? We got involved because our sons are they're fishing over on Salish Island, so it's basically in South part of Bellingham Bay. And the Monday morning at 7:30 in the morning, they sent me a picture, and they asked, "What are these?" They were fishing for kings, so we were catching some kings and a couple silvers. And you know, my response was, "Oh, those are Atlantic salmon." And I immediately called the tribal office, and they said there had been a couple other reports of them. So they called the fish farms, and no, they actually called WDFW, and WDFW did say that they had been notified over the weekend, but it was just a message left on an answering machine. Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And, they, Cook Aquaculture didn't have any phone numbers for after hours, so they could just leave the message on the answering machine that they had had a spill. And why any of this mattered, these are Atlantic salmon, they weren't Pacific salmon. They're invasive, they are not natural to our area, and at the time, we didn't know and still don't know if these fish contained any viruses or any other things that could impact our wild salmon. And it kind of has come at a crucial time for a lot of our local runs. And we didn't know if these fish were going to be preying on our juvenile salmon either. But it started with those two fish that my boys caught, and then their next set, they caught 50. You know, and these fish are ugly. They smell bad. They actually smell like what they've been being fed, and the antibiotics and the treatments. And it was a good week and a half. It was a week before they set up the command post. So before Washington set up the command post with all the different departments, after they pointed fingers at everyone and said, well, this is sort of your fault, no, this is your fault, and no one had a plan to clean them up. And WDFW's response for the cleanup was to let all the recreational fishers just go try to catch them with hook and lines, which to me was, well, what about our stocks that are endangered? We have some ESA listed Chinook, and it's like you're setting everyone out to go fish on everything. It didn't seem like a very good response for a spill. I certainly hope if we actually have an oil spill in Bellingham Bay that we manage to handle that better than what these how the Atlantic salmon were handled.
So there was 300,000 in the I don't know how much folks have seen, but the actual pen itself was as a result of lack of maintenance, and it actually just broke into itself, so that they didn't know that what the situation was. And of course, you could see that people couldn't. They were really struggling with responding to it. They were almost to the place of where they were going to go ahead and release them. So they were, I think, 8 to 10 pounds, and so
harvest.
They were ready to harvest. Our concern is that the timing is such that our outbound migration of our fry from our rivers is coming out at the same time, and we were wondering, what's the predation issues? How do we measure the metric on that? We're also concerned that, as we come to find out later, that this wasn't the first spill, nor that there was a major, well, I guess in late 1990s, there was 100,000 fish that actually got loose in one of the pens down towards the south, and there was no media on it. They buried it. Then in the early 2000s, there was a major disease outbreak in Manchester area there, and they had to actually kill all the fish in there, and then they come to find out that because the state did not have a good, tight permitting and oversight process, the state was not allowed to come in and monitor the actual disease problem, and so there's no media, no history on exactly what type of disease it was and what type of impact it had. And so when you start to see this stuff, it then showed that it was very self-regulating, but it didn't appear that people were handling it very well. And that's when Ellie was talking about, when the conversation started with us, the governor and the state agencies, everybody said, well, I'm just supposed to do this part, but nobody's linking all the pieces together in terms of how do we protect the salmon from basically the invasive species in the farm salmon system, because there's no adequate oversight. And, some of you may have seen that there, I think an article just came out in the Seattle Times yesterday or the day before, that the governor, seeing that Cook aquaculture was, even though he put a moratorium on the no new pens, they wanted to bring them another 1 million fish and go ahead and put them into their pens. And so then when he went to try to stop it, he come to realize he doesn't have no permitting or regulatory oversight to be able to stop it. So that even though they haven't come to the conclusion as to what happened and how we're going to solve this problem off into the future, he couldn't stop them. So they're bringing them now another 1 million fish into the pens, even though we don't know whether the pens are safe or not. So you can see the challenges that we're facing in terms of what's going on with time here. And again, they're invasive species. When our kids were sending us pictures, because of this is my perspective, I'm clearly not a scientist or any of the other stuff, but we could actually see some of them would have 2 chins, and then when they actually cut them open, they seem, because of the hormones they're using to really feed them so they can get the accelerated growth rate. That's why they found out that they prefer the Atlantic salmon versus some of the Pacific salmon to grow at this very fast growing rate, that they would damage some of the other organs because of the accelerated growth rate. Then, of course, you hit them with antibiotics to make sure that they deal with the disease issues. And then when you get close to market, you hit them with food coloring so you can get the more red coloring within the salmon so that it appeals to the consumer. So this is basically dealing with like the chicken farms raised in China without any oversight. And unfortunately, it's right here in the Northwest, and our big concern is going to be since we run on 4-year cycles on our salmon, if we do have some disease issues here that hit some of our outbound fry, or in terms of our spawning fish, we're not going to see it from 4 to 8 years. And so then now we're into what's going to happen if we have a catastrophic thing from 4 years from now? Is it going to be one where they're going to say, no, it wasn't us, but yet the salmon are going to be gone? That's what our big concern about this here is. And as you've probably seen, our tribe got pretty involved in it, and our tribe is, even though we've dealt with some of the issues of what we call the recovery, we've dealt with part of the recovery costs, and we've received some funds to cover that. Our tribe has never relinquished any position in terms of further damages, and so our tribe is going to be spending quite a bit of time reviewing the long-term impacts on the fisheries and the kind of damages that's going to happen, not just to our tribe, but to the salmon here in the Northwest.
And all of this is important because it's all impacting few wild salmon we have left. And it's true, we're commercial fishermen for a living, but it's so much deeper than that. It's fish culture. They're our culture. And we can't let them get to where there's not any more fish left to catch out there.
I want to mention that last couple of years as I was trying to understand a little more about why the fish stocks are being diminished, I got to visit with some of our technical folks and our folks that work within our natural resource department. They referred me to a book called the Salmon, the 1,000-Year Journey of Salmon. It's by Mr. Montgomery. If anybody is interested in that, it's a great book to read. It's kind of a hard read, at least it was for me. I had to read it 2 or 3 times. But he went back in time and I think he went clear back to the 1500s and talked about the effort to save the Atlantic salmon in the United Kingdom. And that even with all the effort clear up to the monarchy, and they had the same issues, pollution, some damming, some competing interests, and they weren't able to save the Atlantic salmon in the United Kingdom in the 1500s. And then he went to the East Coast and went from the East Coast of the United States up into Canada and Newfoundland, through up to Greenland, and then he took it through time as to, even though we had more information, we had better information in terms of the biology and the technology, we still weren't able to save the Atlantic salmon on the East Coast. And I described why that was that way. And then he came over to the West Coast and started the Sacramento River and said what happened there. It took it through time. The same thing happened there. Then he came up the Thunder River, and then of course we're into the Fraser River, and then up our coast here in terms of why is, even with all this effort, even with all this knowledge we have, why are we still getting less and less fish? And it's very complex, but it's also, it's very simple in the sense it's about the lack of political will. That we do know what we have to do. It's whether or not we're willing to do it. And then, as you heard me talking about earlier, it's about the competing interests. For example, our tribe right now is spending some time with some farmers because we have issues of the coliform count coming down the river with cattle and also with agriculture, and we're working with them to try to see if we can resolve our differences and say, how do we maintain the water quality coming down the river, because we also have shellfish beds there, and we're trying to work that through. How do we do that without putting them out of business, and at the same time, of course, not putting us out of business? And so it's a good initiative of how we're trying to work it through. So then there's another book called Fish Without Rivers, and it's about the industrialization of the hatcheries to mitigate the, for lack of my words, progress. And that is, how do we deal with that? And again, he spent a lot of time in Oregon talking to them folks down there, and I still remember one of the conversations there was about in the early 1900s. There was a technical science policy level staff that was debating how should we deal with the development of the Columbia River and the Fraser River, and so it was international. They couldn't come to an agreement, so the Canadians said we're going to go ahead and leave the Fraser River a wild river, and then on the U.S. side we decided we were going to go ahead and domesticate the Columbia River. And now you see where the difference is, and to the point of where, again, I don't think it's anybody's maliciously trying to do anything, but when you put dams on rivers, what happens? You know, we wanted the cheap power. We see the benefits of pulling water from the river to be able to create the arid lands for the agriculture. The commerce has been developed on the Columbia River, but in the early days of them dams, there was no fish ladders, let alone the estuaries and the natural places where the salmon spawned along the way, going up the river, and they put them big reservoirs and lakes in place. There was no place for the fish to spawn. Huge, huge Chinook runs were wiped out on the Columbia River. Now we spent, through people's good efforts, I think it was like $6 billion. And I don't think we're any closer of their Columbia River recovering. So it's going to take, though, I think, again, from my perspective, I'm kind of an optimist, but we all have to admit we have a problem first. We all have to be willing to share in the problem and feel the pain of it to be able to try to solve the problem. The other thing they talked about was the resiliency of the salmon. If we just give them a chance, they'll do it. We do have an additional challenge now, though. We have climate change. And we all know the politics around that one. I mean, huge raging debate going on right now, but it's real. We experienced that up here in our fishery here. It's called the blob. We've seen a major temperature thing happen in the north end of Vancouver Island. And as a result of that, we haven't been able to fish on the Fraser stocks for the last 2 years. And we don't know if that's going to be another 2 years too. And so when we see the Atlantic salmon happen, that multiplied it, because here we're fishing on very few fish as it is, just trying to make a living. And of course, we've got challenges of trying to protect the smolt and the fry coming out of our river, and then we have the Atlantic salmon happen. So it's kind of like piling on. So you can see we're very engaged in figuring out for the long term how we're going to have to go ahead and see if we can rejuvenate the salmon here. Talk about the reef-net anymore? Go ahead and talk about it. I think that's pretty much what we've got. We're open to questions. I wonder if anybody has any questions for us. Yes?
What can you do to support your efforts?
I think the
I'm just here to see.
the pretty face. I think what happens is I've had the benefit of seeing how people try to manage situations, and I was watching the Atlantic salmon, for example, is the best thing that can happen is to not let things die. Is stay informed, keep wondering why things are like that, because I was watching Cook Aquaculture. Of course, they're a $1 billion company. They're from Canada, and I seen they really staffed up. They staffed up with the best attorneys. They put in the best PR folks. They really put in the political folks, and I've seen them really spinning the media on this stuff. And so it's really about then trying to keep an open mind and hearing what's all the aspects of this. And the way I look at the area that we all call home, the Northwest, our people happen to be here before some of your folks came here, but there's a reason we all came here. And that's what concerns me the most is are we going to let this become what other folks want this to be? Or are we going to make sure it becomes why we're here? That's what I think is the most important for you, and when you have your family and your children, is when you hear us talk about our children, we want to provide them with the life that we had. And that we think that's the most important of all. And there's a reason we just love the Northwest. I mean, we're on the water all the time, and we see now the tankers anchored in our fishing spots, and they're talking about developing all this stuff and all this commerce that's coming in here, and we're saying, well, we just want to be on the water. There's a lot of times we don't catch any fish at all. And right now we're not catching very much fish, but we're still on the water because we love it here. We love it. Our culture's so tied to it. There's a lot of spirituality with us, but I would say to you that even if you're on the water, you'll find out there's lots of spirituality being on the water if any of the folks love the water. And that's the reason we're all here. I mean, this is a beautiful place. I've had the opportunity to travel and work in other places, but I don't think there's any place as beautiful as the Northwest with the 4 seasons we've got. And I think the critical thing is we all got to protect that. And we've got to protect it not just for you, but for your children and your children's children. Thank you.
Maybe don't eat farm fish. Simply asking in a restaurant, is it farmed or fresh?
Or wild.
Wild, yeah. If we stop eating farm fish, that would probably go a long way. Maybe those farms will go away.
There is I think just on that article on 1 million fish that they're talking about putting in the pens, I think there was a result of that article to go ahead and call the governor. There was actually a number to call, and there was something where you could actually write to him. But that activism is also very important, you see. Yes.
Thank you for being here and sharing your stories with us. I wonder, you talked about going fishing in Alaska, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your usual and custom fishing area here, and how the fishing is locally, and sort of your reasons for needing to. I'm assuming you wouldn't go to Alaska if you could get all the fish
Sure. I'll talk about it from the standpoint of the QSB Washington and the Bolt decision. A lot of folks thought that the Bolt decision happened in 1974. From the outside, that's how it looked. From our people's perspective, our people negotiated a treaty with the United States in 1855, and they reserved, because again, it's so tied to our culture and who we are and where we come from, that they said that we wanted to make sure that we could fish forever, because it was so important to us. And so then after the agreement, I can remember getting involved in the early 70s within our community, and our elders and our council people would be saying, well, we have a treaty right. We have a treaty right, and I'd be saying, okay, well, how come, then why are we fishing? Why isn't that going on? And so then it was a push for that, and there's a lot of history of court cases in the early 1900s leading up to QSB Washington, and leading right up to the protests that led to that. Our tribe was clashing a lot just on our river on the steelhead issue over there. The sportsmen thinking it was just a trout, even though our people had fished for the steelhead forever. But that was a big, huge clash. The clashes on the Sxwo'le River, the clashes on the Puyallup River, the clashes at Quinault. And so, not too many of you are older like us, a few of us folks here, but the civil rights issues were going on. Some of us were doing our time in the military. I spent my time. Well, let me back up a bit. I actually was a Western here at 66 and 67 and got drafted during the Vietnam time. But when I came back, then all the activism was going on with the civil rights issues, the big disputes over Vietnam, and then the fishing rights issues. And so that's where all this culminated in terms of actually the forcing the United States to, as the second court case. Some folks aren't familiar with what they call the Bologna decision, which is the QSB Oregon, which actually was done before QSB Washington. And then the same thing happened. So then within the court case, it led to 4 years of litigation before a conservative Republican judge who knew nothing about fishing. And so there was a huge court case that happened, and the judge kept hearing that from especially the tribal elders in terms of the history of why fishing was so important to us. And he concluded that the history of how they marginalized our people and moved us off the water and pushed us basically back to the rivers, and then said we were killing the fish off because we were fishing in the rivers. This is my perspective. I'm not just offering that as how we've seen this. And so then he ruled that we had a right to 50% of the fish. There was a number of our folks on our side that say we didn't win 50% of the fish, we lost 50% of the fish. And so you can see the difference of opinion. The unfortunate side of this thing, and this is my personal perspective, is that they had that decision not happen, we wouldn't even have the fish we have now. I think that created a real opportunity to even though there was major disputes, and I come from a fishing family. My dad, like you heard me I spent a lot of time in Alaska. We lost lots of friends that our family had in that dispute there when that came out, because we were close to lots of the other fishing families. We have the fishing families within our community, but there's a lot of fishing families from within this area here, in Bellingham, Seattle, and Gig Harbor and stuff, and Blaine. And so a lot of them friendships went away. It's great to say now that a lot of them friendships are coming back, because we're looking at how do we survive. Because a lot of them guys were pushed to Alaska. You heard of us in the earlier days. We were pushed to the river, and then we had to rebuild our fleets. And during that court case, through both of our elders given testimony and from the anthropologists and given their testimony, they had to lay out where were our people fishing during them times when he took them dates. And so that's what we call our usual and custom areas. And we have our exclusive usual and custom areas, And then we have our ones where we jointly do it with other tribes. And so then our management schemes are all based around that. And so the management process is a very complicated process, but I consider it more of an art than a science, but it's very close to a science in terms of how do we manage the resources, because we're looking at fish coming down through lots of areas, and we're trying to make sure that the most important thing is that we practice conservation. So what's the minimum amount we can harvest at each station along the way so that we can perpetuate the stocks? That's all on top of this other issues of not having good habitat, or now we've got climate change issues. So there's a very complex process that goes on at tribal levels, intertribal levels, tribal state levels, tribal multi-state levels, and then international levels that goes into an annual fishery management harvest plan. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Has the fairly recent Sxwo'le River dam removal project helped at all in spreading the word of opening up more of the major rivers like the Columbia and the Snake River and Klamath River and those rivers for better access of the fish going up the rivers? I know they did a tremendous job there on the Sxwo'le River removing those three major canals.
It certainly showed that there's hope that all the rivers can be brought back.
And I just recently saw a program on the salvaging or reclaiming the Klamath River through Northern California and Southern Oregon. And as you said, that's probably the only thing a person can do. Like the Colorado River is opening up now. They're taking out a couple of those new reservoirs.
Really speaks to the resiliency of the salmon.
Yes.
Give them a chance.
Yes.
I mean, it's incredible what they can do if they just give it a chance, and they actually can recover.
My old harbor was Monterey Bay, just below Tah Mahs Kinley, which is now a research, oceanographic research station now. And when I was there, it was quite a large fishing fleet. And just south of there is the Salish Sea, which is one of the major rivers in that general area. And they're thinking right now of opening that up because it's been kind of naturally blocked by sandbars and buildup,
But of course, up here in the Puget Sound, just working on the rivers isn't enough either, because, I mean, you can make a healthy river, but then if those fish have to come through the Puget Sound to get out to the ocean, and they're actually finding out that quite a few of the baby salmon aren't even making it out of the Puget Sound.
The tribes in the lower sound are finding that they can track their fish coming as far as the Tacoma area, and then they can't track them anymore. But they were finding that up in Canada, there's a big dispute up around Campbell River and Seymour Narrows, where they replaced a lot of the fish farms, and they're seeing a lot of the fish that have to fry outbound, have to go through that maze of fish farms up in that area. And of course, there's big disputes going on up there, both on the political and the technical side. Plus, there's huge political problems going on because they just bury all this stuff. Yes, sir?
Are the Lummi actively teaching reef-netting to future generations in a school setting or in a longhouse out on one of the islands at Orcas Island?
There's a whole conversation going on at Lummi right now in terms of revitalizing the reef-net. One of the things we were seeing, this from our personal experience, was we you heard that we have a first seiner, and so we've taken some folks from the schools out, but more importantly, we've taken some of our children out. And we come to realize after we took some of them out that even though we knew who some of the children were, we were very surprised at how few of them had been on the water. And so they didn't know that a lot of they come from the fishing families, and they haven't had the benefit of being able to be on the water. So we see the reef-net because it's a place-based fishery, and there's a real active side of one of the sets of the gear that can get dangerous at times, but there's another side that's very passive, and it's a safe place, and we think that's a real opportunity to be able to provide the opportunity for a lot of the children that haven't come from the more recent active fishing families to be able to go back a little bit more about who they are and where they come from. I also believe by being on the water that will also help them in terms of their own wellness.
Just as a follow-up to that, do you find that those children are interested in going back out to the water once you introduce them to that?
They all seemed very interested. It was amazing to know we had children that haven't been on boats, haven't fished. And if you haven't done that, how do you know that the islands are filled with our village sites? I mean, that is where we came from. We didn't come from this little reservation that we were put on. So to have a whole generation that didn't know that, it's something to really look forward to. We now have the reef-net, and we're still working on getting it into the schools, starting probably with college.
Yes, sir. I still see a virtue.
Thank you for coming here. At this university, we pride ourselves on pursuing creating new knowledge. But in this place, you and your predecessors are the people who created this place. And so you hold both the traditional knowledge and the keys to what knowledge may be important for how we live in the future. So I'm wondering, the way we usually go about creating knowledge is to pursue our own interests, usually without consultation with you, without understanding how that fits into how this place came to be. So I'm asking you, what new knowledge would you like us to pursue, either in consultation with you or on our own, that would help us address some of the problems we're talking about?
From my standpoint, you heard me talking about the pond getting smaller. I think if we're going to protect this place, we're going to have to do the necessary research and strike the balances that we need to do to be able to continue to make this the best place to live and grow our families here. And so I think we're starting doing some of the stuff. I mean, the folks between the relationship between our college and Western, and then just people. Ellie's pretty active in Sea Feast. I don't know if the folks attended Sea Feast this last couple of years. Ellie's been very active, and we were really surprised in talking with the folks as we were doing Sea Feast that how few of people in Bellingham and Whatcom County realize we've got a real active marine side of who our community is.
There were people in Bellingham who didn't know there was a harbor down there. Which was like, really? I can't believe that, but it happens, so. And there's so many aspects. I mean, simply learning that solid docks aren't doing any good to marine estuaries, But, so, yeah, go with the open grading, that's what we're teaching, right? And then I hear someone say, well, but now they're saying the cement pilings aren't, so I think it's a constant learning curve. Figure out what kind of docks are going to be best for the Puget Sound. That would be nice.
The question's way up there.
What is your opinion on the effect of hatchery salmon on surviving or the survival rates of wild salmon?
Great question. As I was starting to look at this stuff, and I looked at back in the 70s when I first got involved. The hatcheries was the public policy, both federal and state. And then now as we're looking, that clearly the wild stocks are the the actual wild salmon are the way to go. My question is issues of time. In looking at our folks, I was thinking, well, okay, ideally we'd all love to have just straight wild salmon, but we've got to have habitat. And we've also got to have better ocean conditions, climate change. How do we transition time to be able to allow that to happen? And then all the competing interests, both on the river and on the impacts on the climate change issues, so that people can still be able to provide for their families through time. In my opinion, that's the challenge of why you hear me talking about that. First, we have to agree that there's a problem. Second, we have to agree that what we contribute to it, and then what we're willing to do to share in the pain to fix it. That's that optimistic side. I think we have no choice, unless we all move to Alaska, because we're not going to have the reason why we're staying here, you know.
We're out of time, we're going to a presentation, but the room is still open, so we can continue in a
So we've got
informal.
a little bit of work left to do, so just hang tight for about 1 or 2 more minutes, a little bit of closing words, and then a few gifts to our speakers. And I just want to clarify one thing that they've been very, very humble. And if you look at that timeline of the Cook Aquaculture fish release, Cook Aquaculture said on Saturday or Sunday that they lost about 1% of their fish, around 3,000, due to the eclipse. Ellie's boys caught 2 of them on Monday. Due to their connections, they sent some friends out to look at this, and including a former Northwest Indian College student. And they flew that area with a drone and got this aerial imagery that showed that this net is completely crushed, that you can see all the way to the bottom and there are no fish in it. That video and images were played around the world. And that, I think, really helped bring this issue up and create some of that response. And so I'll leave you with 2 questions. One is, what if they weren't out there? What if they didn't call that alarm? And secondly, what if Cook said, on Saturday, we just lost all of our fish, come help us? I think we would have seen 2 different things there. And so when you receive this sort of information, these gifts, it's your responsibility to go out and share what you've learned today. So that's something you have to take forward with you. In closing, we have a few gifts to thank our speakers here.
And the child that sent me the photo of the Atlantic salmon's back there in the corner, he's still.
Thank you so much for giving so much for your time.
Thank you.
Salish Sea and our water bottle.